All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 5 tonight. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We're going to finish out the chapter and look at several verses here and work through them. Um, and I guess the best way to kind of begin the conversation tonight is the same way we've begun many times in this conversation through Solomon sort of wrestling with the reality of the world while also dealing with the vast spiritual depth that exists in his understanding, his coming to an understanding of really what God has called us to do, what God has called us to be, and the way that God has called us to live. And so, the best way I can think to kind of hone us in on really what we're going to talk about tonight is to talk about someone who builds. They spend their entire life amassing wealth with the intention of building their dream house, right? And they do everything they can to get enough funds to have to enough to buy the land and to do everything that they want to do. So they build the house. It's got all the bells and whistles that they've ever wanted. It's literally everything that they could ever imagine. They spare no expense. Everything is custom. There's high tech, everything you can imagine. It's made from the most quality material. It's kind of like it becomes his legacy, right? It becomes his sanctuary, his place. But then, after all that work and all that determination, all that dreaming and all that dreaming coming to light in this house, one night, and if for folks in Florida and folks in North Carolina, they know that this can be true. And one night, a storm comes through, and the waters rage and the winds rage, and in an instant, that dream house is gone. Right? Everything is gone. All that work, all that effort, all of that money, in a matter of minutes, is wasted. What Solomon shows us over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes is that the things that we love to run to, the things that we love to run after, they are fragile. They oftentimes have no lasting meaning in this world, right? And we've talked about it in a bunch of different ways throughout Ecclesiastes so far. And one of the things I've told you, kind of, in I've said many times, just kind of joking. It's not original to me, but you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul, right? You're not taking any of this with you, right? You may spend your life building your dream house, and then one day you get too old to take care of it, and you sell your dream house, and you move into a small condo somewhere. You move into something that's more that you're more capable of taking care of, and then someone else takes over your dream house, and it's like, man, it's gone. And then we talk about, Solomon talks about in other places, right? That you may be the greatest in your generation. You may contribute so much to your generation, and guess what? You're going to be forgotten. Right? How many people in history have made major contributions in this world, and they're forgotten eventually? I mean, it's just the nature of the reality, the things that we as as created beings, as fallen beings, the things that we want to run after, the wealth, the possessions, the status, the things that we feel like bring security to our life, right? Those things, Ecclesiastes over and over again tells us those things are fleeting, man. Those are the things that never last, right? I mean, you ask some of those people who poured their life savings into like some of the cryptocurrency, right? And like they pour their life savings into it, and like in a month they are disgustingly rich, right? And they're like, man, I'm living the dream, and they think they have all this money, and what they don't realize is how much that stuff changes. And so one month you could be a billionaire, and the next month you could be broke, right? And there are people in that situation, right? Because all of that stuff is fleeting. And so, if anybody is going to tell us about that reality, Solomon would be the guy, right? He's the richest man, as far as we know. In comparison, Bill Gates and them, they really didn't have anything on Solomon, right? Because not only did he have all the wealth in the world, but his wisdom, right? His wisdom surpassed that of any other. He had this incredible wealth and knowledge. He had prestige in the world. He had everything that we could ever imagine that would bring security and life and joy and all of those things. And Solomon comes along and says, and all of that stuff left me empty at the end of the day. He said, I had so many wives and all these concubines. I had all this stuff. I had all these houses and palaces, all the gold in the world. And when I laid my head down at night, I was empty. Now, the good news, what we're going to see tonight in Ecclesiastes 5, is that this is another one of those rare occasions where Solomon kind of brings us to reality, but then he points us to an even greater reality, right? He points us to the hope that we can have. Right? He points us to the way that we do find contentment in this world, because that is an important thing for us. Even as Christians, it's an important thing for us to find contentment. So, a couple of things I want us to think about as we work through this, as we're talking about this. I want us just in our minds to be kind of thinking through the question, what does true contentment look like? That's the first question. Second question, how do we handle wealth and power in a way that honors God? How do we handle what God has entrusted to us in a way that honors Him? And the third thing is, how do we find lasting joy in a world full of temporary stuff, right? How do we find joy in a world where everything is passing away, including our bodies, including our money, where everything is going to the wayside? Ecclesiastes chapter 5, beginning in verse 8, this is what Solomon said. We're going to read through it and then we'll talk about it. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is all vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he's the father of a son, and he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and he shall take nothing for his toil, that he may carry away in his hand. This is also a grievous evil, just as he came, shall he go. What gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all the days he eats in the darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. What I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is a gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart. Now, if you just go through and you read Ecclesiastes, Solomon is very poetic in his writing. If you know anything about him, you know that there's another book attributed to him, right? The Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, right? It's a little bit raunchy. Just going to tell you that it is there's a lot about what does it look like to have a biblical sexual relationship that's manifest there, but there's a lot of poetry that's in there, right? I hope it's poetry, because I'm pretty sure if I said to my wife, you have a neck like an ivory tower, that would not necessarily be received as well as when Solomon says it. I won't say some of the other things because I'll blush, but you know, he's very poetic in the way that he delivers the truth, and this is no different. What Solomon does is he doesn't just say, hey, you know, if you run after money and stuff, your life's going to be a train wreck. He's very poetic and very intentional in the way that he communicates these things. And he begins this section here, and he says, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there is yet higher ones over them. What Solomon does is, and really at the heart of what Solomon's going to be talking about throughout this portion of the text is the issue of greed, right? And so what he's looking at right here, right off the rip, is the reality of oppression in the world and the denial of justice in human society, right? And those aren't, and this isn't like one of those weird, like, we're not going into the social justice thing and all that jazz, because I'm not about that. But what I am about is recognizing the reality in the world that we live in. And when we look at the world that we live in, it would be foolish for us to say, no, there's no injustice in the world, there's no oppression in the world, everything is fine, everything, right? No, we don't say that because we recognize that we can turn on the TV and see what is right in front of us, right? No matter how dumb the media think we may be, we know, we recognize when things aren't right. We recognize when there's corruption, right? And that's ultimately what Solomon is getting at here, right? Corruption that's not just about our individual actions, but that is embedded in our systems, right? And I'm not talking about, that social justice movement. What I'm talking about, even in our American system, we can look at this and see, right? A politician goes into office making $100,000 and they spend 4 years in office and they're worth $15 million. That something is wrong there. I'm no mathematician, but it's not adding up, right? Something ain't right, right? If it stinks, there's a reason it stinks, right? And so we know there's corruption embedded in that, right? We see that. We're not dumb. We know. We know that in some of the systems that we live among, that there are officials behind it that prioritize personal gain over right and wrong. Right? There are people out there in Congress right now who, if you wrote them the right check, they would vote for whatever you wanted them to vote for. Right? Didn't matter whether they had a conviction about it or not, because it mattered how many Benjamins came with the check that you wrote. That's where their conviction ultimately lies. Why? Well, because built within them is that greed, that power that they feel that my obligation is to I, me, my. Right? And the way that I need to meet that obligation to I, me, my is that I have to give these people lip service and say, well, yeah, these are my convictions, but I also know that it's hard to vote out an incumbent. So once I've won an election, even if I do dumb stuff, people are likely to just keep voting for me because they know my name, right? And so that's the nature of the world that we live in, right? That at every level of authority, right, that there are those who exist in that level that are serving their own interest, right? That they don't care about anything else other than themselves. They don't care about anybody else. They don't care about anything else. And so Solomon says here, we shouldn't be surprised by that, right? If it shocks you the way that our politicians work, you really just haven't been paying attention, right? Because it's not shocking. I know that because we live in a fallen world, right? And listen, we can't fix the systems because the systems aren't the problem. It's the people that are the problem, right? I joke all the time, and I will continue to joke this way, that if it weren't for the people, church would be easy, right? The same thing is true here. If not for the people, the world would run very smoothly. Because it's not that the systems are broken, it's the people that run those systems. They're the ones that are flawed by sin. They're the ones that are in it for their own gain. And so if you expect and you hope that we're going to fix the systems in this world and everything's going to be made right, Solomon says, I say, because God says, that you're going to be someone who lives a very disappointed life. Right? You're going to be very, very disappointed because the systems of this earth are going to fail you. It's God's justice. It's God's will that are perfect. And God's will is that He transforms our heart. He makes us new, a new creation, right? He gives us a different perspective on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He gives us a different perspective on loving our neighbor, serving our neighbor, right? He gives us a different perspective on ourselves, right? God does all of those things, and so ultimately we trust in Him above all else. But listen, even with the flawed systems, there's benefit in government. Like, I'm not an anti-government person. I'm an anti-big government person. But Solomon says in verse 9, but this is the gain for the land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. What is he talking about? Listen, what he's talking about and what he's pointing to is a picture that the reason the fields are cultivated, the reason that there is a system that is working is because the king has instituted this system that brings about stability and economic success. Not he's not ignoring the fact that some people in that system it works a lot better for. He's not ignoring that. He's saying, yeah, that's problematic, but government and governance is a good thing, right? Because if not, if all the systems of the world were dependent on us as individuals, meaning that if I could just go in tomorrow and say, and the IRS called me and said, this is the deal, and I said, oh nope, there's no governance, there's no IRS, I just get to do what I want, then you can realize how quickly that would devolve into an absolute train wreck, right? Because not everybody has the same values and things like that. And so Solomon says, listen, it's human government is not perfect, right? The leadership is not perfect, but at some level it does serve the common good, right? And that is the beauty of the system that we live in as Americans, is that, yeah, we have politicians who do dumb things, and yeah, it is hard to get rid of an incumbent, but I mean, in Ohio, you can just ask some of our senators, right? Because one of them got ousted. So it's not impossible, right? It's not impossible to change, but I mean, there are things that it does take time and effort and energy. But the system that we have, it's a broken system, but we recognize that it exists for at least some measure of common good. And so I think that's why God tells us in His Word we pray for our leaders, right? Because not only has God instituted those leaders, both for our good and sometimes for our judgment, but also that we need to recognize that even in the bad times, that there is some measure of good that we can see in where we're at least right now, where we're at. Even when things are more expensive and hard, right, for us to work through, they're still good because we still have freedom, right? We still have the opportunity to gather here, right, and worship the Lord without fear of persecution and all those things. Those are good things that we celebrate. Verse 10, he says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is vanity. Well, of course, right? The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? And so we know this to be true, that that most of the time rich people are never happy with how much richness and wealth they have. They always want more, right? They want to accumulate more and more. Well, why is that? It's because the illustration that Solomon is giving here is, again, this manifestation of greed, right? Those people in this world who set their heart on money and material stuff, right? They are never satisfied, right? Because there's always a new model of the car coming out. There's always a new model of a phone coming out. There's always a new model of something else coming out. There's always a Tesla that drives longer, that charges faster, right? There's always a new model of a Lamborghini or whatever people drive now that are super rich, or Maserati or whatever, right? There's always a new model, and so they're never satisfied. So they're always looking for more, and more. Why is that? Well, because wealth is a deceptive thing. Because the truth of the matter is that at some level in the world that we live in, it is a very comforting thing when you look at your bank account and you say, you know what? If something tragic happened tomorrow, my family is going to be just fine for a long time. Like, there's comfort in that, right? The flip side is that your bank account may be healthy and then one zero drops off the end and you're still in a really good spot, but you've become so accustomed to that nest egg and that wealth that, man, now we have a problem when we really don't have a problem, but it's all up here, right? When you set your mind on these temporary, unreliable sources of joy and fulfillment and security, what tends to happen is you are, if I could use a New Testament example, it's like you're always filling your head full of knowledge, but you're always learning, but you're never wise. You're not gaining any real knowledge, right? You're just consuming. Love for money, the reason it's the roots of all kinds of evil is because it is an all-consuming pursuit, right? Because the Bible says over and over again, you're never going to be satisfied. That's why Paul says, listen, I don't trust in this stuff. I don't trust in the stuff I can amass. He said, I've had a little bit, I've had a lot. Food to eat, my belly's been empty. He says, but ultimately, what does he say? I trust in Philippians chapter 4. He's like, I trust in God's provision. That God has seen me through, right? God has given me everything that I need, right? God has shown me what it means to not pursue the things that don't matter and the things that pass away, but instead to store up for myself treasures in heaven. Right? Those things which the things of this world can't take away. Like a godly legacy, right? Things of this world can't take that away. Verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. What advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? This is Solomon's way of saying that the more wealth you amass, the more people who depend on it. Now, I don't know. I've never been rich, so I couldn't tell you. But I've seen this in operation in the world, right? As your wealth grows, so do the people who depend on it. That may be family. That may be employees. That may be even opportunists in your life, right? What Solomon is saying ultimately to us is the owner of that wealth really gains no benefit. Right? So those people who have worked all their life to amass all of this wealth, let's talk about the Hiltons, right? That family. Right? He amassed all of this wealth and he gets to sit and watch. At least they've kind of got their stuff together a little bit. But for a long time, he just watched his family consume all that he had worked for. That's usually how it happens, right? In fact, you turn on these crime drama TV shows, and that's like, man, you can guarantee once, at least every few hours, that's going to be the plot line for one of those movies or those shows, right? That somebody worked for something and somebody else wanted it, and they watched them consume it. And the reality is, when we look at the issue of wealth and greed in the world, wealth is one of those things that brings the illusion of control, right? Because that's often, again, we're not in a perfect world. And so a lot of the times, those people who are elected to office are those who can outspend the other people, right? Who can put their name out and who can spend the most to tear down the other person in the race or whatever. And so wealth brings this illusion of control, but the truth is it doesn't bring freedom, right? Rich people struggle with much more complexity and burden in life than even the poor person, right? It's a different perspective, right? If you don't have a lot of money, you worry about paying bills and eating and all of that stuff, and those things are important things to worry about. But those are those sort of basic necessities to worry about when you amass wealth. I can't imagine what it's like for Elon Musk to manage his wealth and his businesses and his household. I would imagine that if we sat down and talk about the complexities of our life and compared notes, I have a feeling I got not a leg to stand on, because I'm sure that he has a lot more issues, right? Excuse me. It's kind of that saying, more money, more problems, right? Right. More money, more problems. That really is true. And so we have to guard ourselves against that. In fact, Solomon goes on to say, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. Right? You go out there and you kill it every day. You may not be able to buy a mansion and 15 cars, but you kill it every day. You provide for the needs of your family. You love your family. You do everything you can to support them and love them. You lay your head down at night. Sometimes you are full and content. Sometimes you are struggling to make it through. But what do? You open your eyes the next morning, you get up and you go. And you do it over and over again every day. And somehow your heart is full of joy. And people look at that and say, that man is crazy. That man's crazy. And all the while, you have these people with full bellies, right? These rich folks out there who, what do? They take their own life. They have everything in the world. They take their own life because they're empty. They spend so much time protecting and managing and all of those things that they miss the simplicity of life. The simplicity of life that brings peace and contentment. And Solomon is showing us that we should be reflecting on our own priorities. Right? If we're trying to amass a legacy, if that's what we're trying to be about, then it's going to be not only disappointing to us, but it's going to be disappointing to the people around us too. Because, listen, I know that there are people in my family who have done well. I have no idea what my grandparents, I know that they always made sure that we were happy. They always made sure that we had everything that we could have. I have no idea when they pass away what's going to happen. And you know what? At the end of the day, this is what I've said to them. It doesn't matter. The legacy, you've already left the legacy. It doesn't matter what you leave behind. It doesn't matter that you have a will. And it doesn't matter if they were to give me the world or if they give me nothing. None of that stuff matters, because what they instilled in me, what my grandparents instilled in me, is first off to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And they showed me how to do it. They showed me how to do it. I literally believe that I am one of the richest men in all the world. Now, if you call me tomorrow because you can't make a mortgage payment, you're going to find out that I'm rich in a very different way. All right? I'll pray for you and I'll encourage you, right? But I do feel that way because of all the people, all the people who have left a legacy in my own life. A real lasting legacy, one that moth and rust can't take away. Rust, not rust, by the way. Rust. Right? Make sure I get that. I don't want to offend them. But that's what matters, and that's what Solomon is trying to get us to wrap our minds around. That you're going to run your race, and you're going to run it after something. Right? It's the same thing that Paul says, right? That I'm forgetting what lies behind. Why? Because I'm running ahead, right? Why? Because I'm pursuing the upward call. Because I'm called to live and move and breathe, and my being revolves around something outside of this world. I'm running heavenward. And it doesn't mean that we don't recognize the blessing when God does bless us with wealth, because I know many Christian people. I know people. I personally know people who God has blessed incredibly. And I'll tell you this, all of them that I have known, you would never know. But they are the most generous people because they never ask for anything, right? And I've known people that have paid $20,000 bills, just wrote a check, and no one ever knew. In fact, the person they paid the bill for didn't even know. They just do that stuff. Why? Because they're running a race. God has blessed them along the way, and you know what they recognize? That God had in fact blessed them along the way. That it wasn't about them. It wasn't about Even though they were incredibly smart, it wasn't about any of that. It was about what God had done. Because what they didn't know, at least I don't know, maybe they did, but they didn't know the very thing that Solomon would tell us even here. It's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt. You see, when you realize that everything that you have is a gift of God, everything is a gift of God, it makes you see things with a right perspective. It makes you handle things with a right perspective. At least it helps you to. Because it's really easy to come up with a good idea and make millions of dollars, right? I mean, that fidget spinner person, whoever that joker is, like a guy who cannot pay, or a girl, I don't even know who did it, but like can't pay attention to anything. It was like spinning a little thing, and they're like, hey, I'm going to invent this thing, and now they're a bajillionaire, right? Like, how easy is it for us to say, man, I'm one viral video away from being TikTok famous and making bajillions of dollars doing that, if TikTok stays around. But you know, I mean, it's so easy to get wrapped up in that stuff, right? And what Solomon says is that stuff doesn't help you. That perspective doesn't help you. It hurts you, right? If you're driven by desire to have more, then wealth is your idol, right? Then your heart is not in the right place. It means that you're worshiping that which you can amass more than the God of all creation. And greedy people are not generous. They're not generous. People like Bill Gates and people like that, the reason they give away money is so that they don't have to pay the government money, right? They want tax write-offs. They want the ability to get something out of it, right? Bill Gates isn't walking around building houses for homeless people saying, hey, here you go, take this and go and live your life. He's not doing that, right? They're not digging wells in Africa out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're doing it to make name recognition, right? To get meetings and to do all those things. They're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. Well, how do you know? Listen, if every time, I want you to think about this for a second. What if Kyler and I, if I said, hey man, I want you to follow me around. Church is going to pay you to follow me around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And every time I do something generous or I pray for somebody or something like that, we're going to video it. And then we're going to show it on Sunday morning. It would be really cool for the first one. I mean the first video. And then you're going to start feeling a certain way. Right? Like it's going to start feeling what? Showy, right? Yeah. That's exactly what wealth and greed, really not wealth, but that's what greed does. Greed is, I always need to put on a show. I need people to know what I'm doing. Right? I need people to recognize. Solomon even says, and those riches were lost in bad venture. He's the father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. Right? He says, you can be rich, you can amass wealth, you can be on TV, you can do all that stuff. Right? But it's all fleeting. Right? You know how many people have been rich and they're poor now? You know how many people have won the lottery and they're broke? Right? You know how many people have amassed wealth and then blown it by drugs or alcohol or whatever it may be? Riches are not a reliable foundation for our life. Right? If we build our hope on that, man, you're going to be not only vulnerable, you will be that, but you are going to live a life of despair. If we try to find security in that, then it's going to be bad. right? Because I don't know if you know this, but there was a time in this country where there was a thing called a Great Depression that happened, and there were people who had a lot of money, right? And then one moment, really in one day, in one moment, it was gone, right? They had a lot of paper, but they didn't mean anything. And so what do, man? They people were jumping out of buildings. People were taking their own life because they had worked, they had built their life on this foundation, and then it was gone. That should sound familiar to you because over and over again, the scripture gives different ways of putting that, right? We don't build our house on the foundation of sand, right? But on the rock, right? Why? Because when we build our life on the foundation of the stuff in this world that's passing away, you are always going to be disappointed. You're always going to be disappointed. Right? That's the wisdom that Solomon is giving us in painting this picture. And he even says again, as the scripture says over and over and over again, as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. Solomon says, I came into this world with nothing. I am going out of this world with nothing. Right? That's a reality for us. All these pharaohs in Egypt that were buried with all this stuff because they thought they were going to take it into the afterlife, the real bad news for them is at the resurrection of the dead, what they're going to find out when they're ushered into judgment, right, is they're going to find out not only did all that stuff they have here, they're not taking it with them, and God didn't care about any of that anyway, right? They're going to be terribly disappointed by that. Did you know that when you stand before God, that those farmers in the early days of this country who had nothing but faith, do you know that they will stand before the same throne as those who amassed massive wealth and who were buried in these beautiful, elaborate coffins with these $50,000 suits on? That when they stand before God, God doesn't care about any of that. Solomon is giving us that picture. None of that stuff matters, right? Put me in a pine box and put me in the ground. I'm not taking any of this stuff with me. Why would you spend all of that money to honor a body that's empty? Right? My soul will be gone. I'll be in heaven with Christ. I don't need my family to go into debt to make sure that at my funeral I'm honored. Right? I don't need that. Solomon says we don't need that. We're going to put them in the ground. There are much better ways that we honor the people that we love. There are much better ways that we operate in this world, understanding that all the stuff in this world is not how we will ever be defined. This is also a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Solomon says in a different way by asking a question. Just like you came into this world, you're going to exit this world. What are you going to have to show for it if you just chase the wind? What legacy are you going to leave behind? Even if you're frugal, right? Even if you're rich and frugal, right? The people that inherit your legacy may not be so frugal, and your legacy that you work your entire life for could be gone in a matter of days, months, years. Running after wealth, pursuing greed, is toiling for the wind. Something that he said many times so far in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's something we can never catch, but we always chase. It's frustrating when we invest our life in temporary things, because those things are always going to disappoint us. You know that if you drive a Kia or if you drive a Maserati, that one day both of them are going to break down, right? They both have a certain moment where it's going to be it for them. You know that you still have to change the brakes and tires on a Lamborghini, right? Now you're going to spend $17 million more than changing the brakes and tires on a Honda, right? But all those things wear out, all those temporary things. Solomon says, man, we can't be running after that stuff. And listen, if you don't believe that this leads the pursuit, the greed and the pursuit of wealth as a foundation, if you don't believe that it leads to a dark place, if you don't understand why those celebrities really, and I mean this in the most genuine way, if you don't understand why they end up taking their life, why they end up so depressed and all those things, and you just haven't read the scripture enough. Because even Solomon says in verse 17, moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. Solomon says that if you live your life pursuing the love of money and wealth and possessions, then you eat alone in darkness, you're burdened with worry, sickness, anger. Right? There's an emotional and physical toll of misplaced priorities. Right? The things we don't talk about. But running after the wrong things takes a real toll on your mental, emotional, and physical state. Instead of joy, there's obsession. Obsession that leads, again, not to rejoicing, but unhappiness, dissatisfaction. It's never enough. Well, why is that? Well, because you end up prioritizing things like the pursuit of that wealth over your relationships with people. And then you end up with all the wealth in the world and no one there to share it with. Or those who are there are opportunists, right? To consume what you've amassed. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. So Solomon says, after all this really depressing, sort of dark rant, really is what it is. It's a godly rant against greed. And greed is a foundation for who you are. He says there is good. There is good to be found. There is good and fitting ways to deal with this. There's good and fitting ways to understand this. He says enjoy the simple things. Eating, drinking, finding satisfaction in what you do. He says if you believe that those things are opportunities for you to honor God, if you believe that those things are a gift from God, then you can find joy in those things in this brief life that God entrusts to you. You see the difference in perspective? It's not what am I amassing, it's what has God given. And ultimately that is the glaring difference between the rich man who uses his wealth to honor God and the rich man who doesn't. It's his perspective. Does he believe these are gifts from God? Does he acknowledge that every good and perfect gift it comes from the Lord? All his provision comes from the Lord. Or does he believe it's because of what he's done, what he's able to do? Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and the power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is a gift from God. Everyone to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them. To accept his lot, rejoice in his toil, this is a gift from God. True enjoyment in life is not guaranteed by wealth, but it depends on accepting God's sovereignty over your circumstances. I know for a fact that if I hit the lottery tomorrow, that I would do a lot of dumb stuff really fast. I know it. I know that it would take me 15 minutes for me to find someone on the internet for me to have them in my house designing some crazy gun room. Like, I know that. And then I would buy every gun ever made, and I would not use hardly any of them, but I would have them. And I would do that 100%, not even joking. If I hit the lottery tomorrow, even though I just confessed I would do that, I would still do it, right? Why? Well, because it's just the way that I'm dumb like that, all right? But I'm sure my wife would be the gift of God that she is to me, and she would remind me that God had granted us this opportunity to make wise decisions. And it would probably be something like fashioning a craft room, much like my gun room. Just kidding. Um, when we recognize that the ways in which we're blessed in this world truly come from God, it helps us. It doesn't completely free us from the temptation, but it helps us to remain focused, right? It helps us to keep the main thing, right? And so we always have to be reminding ourselves of that reality. Because if not, it's just so easy to get lost, right? It's so easy to take our eyes off the prize. It's so easy to, to not forget what's behind and not be running heavenward, right? What Paul talks about. It's so easy to not do that, that if we're not careful, then we can find ourselves trusting so much in our own self and our own ability and what we've done that we are completely missing the point, right? And if you don't believe me, I didn't write this, Solomon did, and he's living it. He's telling us this is not just, hey, like this is wise advice. He's telling us, hey, I live my life this way. He says, I did all this stuff and I missed the point. Don't do this, right? Don't find yourself in this situation. Don't find the foundation of your heart to be greed, but instead find the foundation of your heart to be thankfulness, joy, contentment in the gifts that God has given to you, and use them for His glory. Now, that doesn't mean that if we hit the lottery tomorrow, we wouldn't have a gun room and a craft room. It just means that we would give 10% to the church. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke. Um, it means that we run the race that God has set before us, recognizing His blessing, living in light of His blessing, and keeping a right perspective on those blessings, not getting lost in the mix of it. And that's really what Solomon is pointing to over and over again. He says in verse 24, he will not much remember the days of his life because God kept him occupied with a joy in his heart. Solomon says, when you have this right perspective, you're not even going to remember the days. You're going to remember the joy. Man, I don't know about you, but I long for that perspective. Because for me, sometimes it's really hard to forget the days, especially the real hard ones. But Solomon says when we have the right perspective, it's the joy. It's the joy that drives us. It's the joy that fills our minds and our hearts. It's the joy of the gifts of God. And that's a good place to be in. I'm working on getting there too.